Welcome to another edition of The Grapevine, brought to you by Herd Astray. We've got a good one this week for music lovers out there. Doesn't matter if you're not a music lover, there's still some great takeaways. But really, we're discussing what we can learn from sort of the makeup of the musical landscape in terms of quality and fame, and how we can use that to better execute marketing campaigns in terms of reach and success. And you know, if we look at the bands out there today, there are some great bands and there are some, quite frankly, really poor bands. And in both categories, there are bands that are really famous. You know, we get really famous bands that are great and really famous bands that aren't great. And really, the point there is the quality of the output is not necessarily the determining factor of their success. And really, I wanted to kind of discuss that with Ed and how we can look at the data and understand that and see how we can use those lessons in our marketing. So, Ed, can you explain why both rubbish and great bands become famous?
Unfortunately, not exactly, right? Otherwise, you know, I mean, the world's greatest A&R band. But there is quite a lot that, you know, science can teach us about this. And I mean, what really comes to mind is quite a famous experiment that was conducted nearly 2 decades ago now at the University of Columbia by Duncan Watts, who went on to work for Yahoo. He was kind of a mathematician, network scientist. And then he did some work with sort of sociologist, psychiatrist Matthew Sauganik. And basically what they did was an experiment in sort of the early days of music being shared and streamed on the internet. I think for this experiment, they actually had to build their own streaming platform, right? That was
Spotify version 1.
It was a streaming platform, and they chose, you know, carefully selected a bunch of songs to go on it, all of which were by new, unheard of bands.
Okay.
Every user, as they went on this website, could choose which music to listen to and could say whether they like that music or not. All they could see on the website was the name of this band, which they've never really heard of, but they could also see how other people have rated that song.
Okay, like a ranking or something.
Yeah, so like a ranking or a score.
Okay.
And what they found was that people were more likely to give higher scores to songs that other people had already given higher scores to.
Okay.
They initially tested this by splitting all of the people in the study into what they called different universes.
Yeah.
And the people in each universe could only see the scores given by other people in their universe.
Okay, yeah.
And in each of the universes, it wasn't the same songs that did well.
Oh, right, okay.
It was different songs in each universe, suggesting the influence of other people's rankings was driving people to kind of like the song more.
That's really interesting, yeah.
To make this even worse, they went, or not even worse, they went one step further. And they actually started lying to people, right, about what the ratings of these songs were. So they would show them fake ratings.
Right, okay.
And they found doing that, they could improve scores by showing fake ratings.
Right, it's almost like take the worst song in the list and say that was the number one, and then all of a sudden everyone started voting for it.
Yeah, that's that sort of thing. It's worth saying there was a small caveat in this, that they found there were some songs that just never did well. Right?
Okay.
There are some songs that were just terrible and never did well.
Well, that's good. So really terrible music will always lose.
They sort of went to like music industry executives, I think it was, after this. The response was a little bit like, yeah, we know, right? They're sort of like, we can tell who the bad bands are, but when it comes to picking the hit makers, we're actually not that good. And the difference potentially comes from the fact that there is some random behavior at the beginning which decides whether people kind of get traction and start getting fans.
And I guess there's parallels there to everything in life, right? There's tons of products that, you know, are not differentiated by their feature set. You know, everyone talks about a USP, but if you look at project management software, I've got to find a new example of it, but like it's just my go-to. Does the same stuff apply there? Is that?
Yeah, definitely. I think the interesting feature in all of these examples that we've mentioned is that you tend to have a large number of failed bands or bands that don't have very many fans and a very small number of massive super bands. This is a particular thing that we find across a lot of products and services and markets. And so, you know, when it comes to phones, there's a very small number of super brands for phone. This is a stark difference to, say, for example, the distribution of people's heights. There's lots of people around the average, and a small number of people are a lot shorter than average, and a small number of people are a lot taller than average. Now, what we find when we have any sort of kind of social behavior around a product is you very much stray away from that. And you have a small number of very large brands and a large number of very small brands. From a mathematical and from a behavioral science perspective, the interesting thing is why does that happen? And I guess at a very base level, what is required to make that happen?
This is linked, I think, to, is it the kind of the Kevin Bacon stuff we talked about last time, in that, I guess if you look at the number of successful actors in the world, there's, versus the number of actors in the world, it's the same thing in terms of a small number of very successful people versus the long tail of everybody.
Yeah, almost certainly it's the same sort of thing.
Okay.
A small number of actors get all the big lead roles. And this might be controversial, but a lot of them you would not say are orders of magnitude better actors than the other people trying to fill those roles.
Okay.
Now, from the mathematical perspective, it is interesting why this could happen, right? And we've talked about one example. People tend to be not very good at making, I say, independent decisions. People are influenced by what other people say about a product, or in more subtle ways, in terms of how many people they see with a different phone or something like that, right? The fact that you see loads of people with an iPhone gives you an idea that an iPhone's probably a good phone. It doesn't have to be, that you go on and check the ratings on the iPhone to find that information out. And then there is another method by which this can happen. What's often called, or was initially called, I say, competitive advantage. And that's this sort of availability idea. So the idea that because something is more common already, more people just see it. So it's instead of making necessarily a direct assessment based on lots of people think this is popular, people just see it enough that they know that thing exists.
I see people drinking Coca-Cola, so I will drink Coca-Cola as opposed to Joe Blogg's homemade cola brand that no one's ever heard of.
Exactly. And that, not because you counted how many people are drinking Coke around you and said, oh, that's more than Pepsi.
Yeah.
But just because you're kind of aware the brand is available.
Yeah.
And so this is something that was sort of first detected, I would say, in network setting by Price, who was a mathematician who was looking at citation networks. So networks of citations in scientific papers. So that's when you write a scientific paper, at the end you write your references. So who have you read that has influenced you to give you the thoughts, and also what evidence are you drawing upon? And what he found was that you could generate these big disparity in number of citations, which is often used as a measure of quality of scientific paper, is how many citations it has. And he found that you could generate that big disparity in number of citations, similar to the thing we see in the size of bands, where you have a small number of papers with lots of citations, lots of papers with very few citations. And you could generate that just by understanding that the more a paper's already being cited, the more likely people are to be aware of it, because they're going to have read a paper that cites it. So that's kind of like this availability can also lead to this big distribution.
Yeah.
This wide distribution between papers without very many citations and a small number of papers with lots of citations.
Yeah.
And this whole thing does have a name, so-called Matthew's Law, which comes from the Bible. The line is about the rich getting richer. So it's this general idea that once you have some fans or some followers, or you're a successful band with lots of fans, it's easier to get more. Another kind of name for a similar effect is the first mover advantage. This idea that if you're the first into a space, getting those initial customers while there's very little competition gives you a head start once other people try and enter the market.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess that's how Facebook started with their campus piece. They certainly weren't the first social network, but they went after quite a niche area to become first in that area, or more popular in that area, if you like.
That's definitely the case. I think the important when you start thinking about this in terms of networks, what you find is that kind of availability. So whether you know about it because your friend is doing it, but also the behavior aspect, the fact that you're being led by your friend's behavior, work together and almost supercharge the effect. If I want to know about something, okay, what do my friends do? But also, which social network to bother joining, I'm going to join the one that most of my friends are on because that's the most useful for me.
Just trying to bring this back from the marketing side. It's really your product gets amplified if the people that know about you are grouped in some way. If you've got 1,000 customers and they're spread randomly over the entire globe, people won't be aware of you, it'll be quite small. But if those 1,000 customers have some form of connection to each other people are going to see your brand as big. They're more likely to be aware of it and more likely to follow it, I guess, from the availability, using that availability example.
It sort of shows the power and is kind of the reason why this thing that we've mentioned before on the podcast, the idea of kind of appearing bigger than you are, right? If you're starting up a startup now, you're not going to be competing with Microsoft this year, but you could be the biggest brand on a street or on a business park or in a particular city. And that is how, a lot of the social networks kind of grew, right? And we've spoken about that before. And the fact that in that case, it was because their product really, really depends upon having their people interlinked. But actually, it's true for any product that the more your customers are interlinked with each other, the more likely it is that you appear kind of attractive.
Yeah. Okay.
When people do that assessment of what do my friends think of this product.
And you said the word attractive there. What this has got me thinking about is if we boil this down to the school playground, you get popular kids and unpopular kids, right? And by I think from what we've talked about, the popular kids gets more popular because people see him or her with lots of friends and want to gravitate towards the more popular kid. But also there's the kind of traditional use of the word attractiveness there, right? It is attractive people, who will generally be the more popular kids at school, in a beauty point of view. Is there a concept of beauty attractiveness that exists in citation networks, film stars, businesses, that isn't necessarily about how something looks? They're just another thing that makes something more appealing than others outside just how available it is, how popular it feels.
That loops round to what we were saying at the beginning about music, right? It's not that people necessarily like what other people like explicitly because they're trying to copy them. What the Watts experiment shows us is they are liking the music that their friends like, aside from how it actually sounds, because of our understanding that other people are also like that music. And I think the same is true for brands, right? That people, a lot of people who have an iPhone, right? My partner's a very good example of this. She insists on having an iPhone. She couldn't tell you why she insists on having an iPhone. Because you don't go out and test drive, a bunch of phones and then decide which one you want the best. You just kind of have to make an assessment of the world around you. And so as a brand, if you can appear a lot of times in that person's assessment of the world, then you're like the music that in the experiment they've, given a high score to.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's really interesting. So then if we use, let's take a B2B SaaS product, what's a more important point about determining its success, at least in its, till it hits the brand availability of Microsoft, say, is how well connected its users are. So when someone new comes along, whether they've likely heard of it from or seen it within their existing social circle, be that professional circle or social circles. But if all their customers are randomly distributed, it's unlikely to surpass a product that maybe has inferior quality but highly connected customers.
Yeah, I think that's fair from the point of view of new products. They definitely require almost some luck, and it's kind of built into a lot of startup, what you might call philosophy, an entrepreneur philosophy, right? This idea of having a niche and trying to exploit that niche. In a lot of cases, that's sort of presented as, because you want to understand your product market and therefore make the product that fits the niche the best. But I actually think a lot of the impact of having that niche comes from building a group of customers who are able to sort of share your product with each other and then your customer base can grow from there.
Yeah, and I guess that's the social proof, the case study thing as well that fuels that. That if you're an insurance business, you feel better about hearing there's people working with other insurance businesses and seeing insurance business logos on the website.
Yeah, exactly. Like, people put logos on websites all the time, and there are some logos that, for very big businesses, for like Microsoft is a classic example of this. Many startups that have a Microsoft logo on their website for a wide variety of connections they may actually have with Microsoft.
Someone from Microsoft signed up for a newsletter once.
Exactly. Is there to kind of bring authority to the products.
Yeah.
And that's one type of authority, or it doesn't tell people that product's for them.
Yeah.
And that's where having, the logos of all of their peers, for example, gives that idea of kind of group attractiveness, to go back to our attractiveness example.
Yeah.
If you work for a large insurance company and you go on someone's website and it says basically that all the other large insurance companies are using them, you start to be worrying why you're not, much more than, like, long before you know what the product does, you're worrying, why don't we use this? What are we missing out on?
So it's almost the ideal logo display on a website, the obligatory, this is what we work with, should be people that your prospects are it's either in the same industry or ideally they already know. That would be super powerful if you could orchestrate that.
Well, yeah, if you could like put the logos on the website of companies where the person knows people that work there, right, in similar roles.
Product feature 2023, January 23, we'll get that in there.
And make it GDPR compliant. And then
yeah, exactly, yeah. Maybe 2024, we might have some engineering to get that done.
But I mean, a good example of this is Uber. When they started, right, their niche they used to talk about would be to try and, get enough Ubers outside a particular board meeting that they knew was ending, for a large, like, Fortune 500 company, because they know those people in the room are talking to each other. And they know if that meeting happens once a month, and the first month they get 2 of them get Ubers back to the airport from there, and they have a really great experience, then the next month, 3 of them get it, 4 of them get it, and then by the end of the year, the company's booking everyone Ubers before the meeting even happens.
Where does does it word of mouth and referrals fit into this? Because it, if I'm hearing, if I go and, I don't know, buy something and someone says to me, check this out, I'm more likely to go and check out that brand, be it the iPhone, be it the whatever it may be. Is referrals just a kind of part of the engine of what we're talking about here?
Word of mouth and referrals are another way, or the real life way that we see those, that little score that was next to the music, that rating, that number of thumbs up. In real life, we hear that through word of mouth, subtle drops into conversation, seeing other people with products, if they're physical products. That's how, as humans, we kind of see what's going on around us and assess whether something's popular. And that's why in the real world, those soft signals are more important. If you're on Spotify, you can see what the most popular song that's played is. But most people don't choose the music that way, right? Their friend suggested it, or they've heard it around, in a lot of cafes that they've been in. Eventually they've been like, I keep hearing this song, I'll look up what it is, Those sort of softer effects show us what's popular much more than actually looking at the rating of the song.
It really sounds, if we replace song choice with marketing campaign, there's a degree of randomness to how successful these campaigns are. So when it comes to, looking back historically over your campaigns over the year, you see a super successful campaign and say, right, let's replicate that. But actually, there's probably a degree of randomness in why that campaign. And if you could rerun history and say, take the same amount of campaigns that you ran that 12 months and run them in another 12 months, the successful campaign might be totally different.
That's definitely true. I think one way of thinking about that is that a campaign that's 100 times more successful is not 100 times better. It may be no better at all. It may be ever so slightly better.
Or worse.
Yeah, it could even be worse, right? And anyone who uses social media for marketing will know that if after you post you get a bunch of comments within 24 hours, then that post might be seen 100 to 1,000 times more than if that post didn't get those comments in the first 24 hours. And that's that kind of first mover advantage, right? You know, it misses out on its first mover advantage and it never gets another chance.
I guess that reminds me, you hear the kids, they'll post on TikTok or Instagram, and if they don't get a certain amount of likes within a certain amount of minutes, they'll delete it. I guess it's that type of principle. But the other thing that's making me think that, a lot of work goes into, as I say, the planning of the content and the messaging. Maybe not as much work goes into the execution. How do we get that? How do we use that first mover advantage? How do we get that early boost? But also, there's probably not enough recognition of sometimes the randomness of it. That actually it might not get the start that it wanted. That isn't always a reflection of the content. It might just be, the dice didn't roll your way that time, and actually, have another go.
That's actually kind of a really important sort of positive message you can take from this, is the idea that, sometimes things do well when they don't deserve it, but equally, a lot of the time, campaigns don't do as well as they probably could have done. Social influencers in particular, I've seen this quite a lot on LinkedIn, is people talk about, recycling posts as an easy way to generate content. The reason they do that is that there's kind of a tacit understanding that just because a post didn't do well the first time doesn't mean it's not going to do well the second time. An understanding of these random processes enables us to kind of not make decisions too quickly, or make judgments rather too quickly. It's really common for videos and things like that to go viral years after they were initially posted, because they kind of get picked up and they get that buzz and they get lucky. And you can kind of think the same with your campaigns. You get the viral video, or the video that's not yet viral, from 2 or 3 friends, and all of a sudden it hits that tipping point. A good example would be, Jimmy Carr got in some hot water, shall we say, at the beginning of this year over his Netflix special. But that'd been on Netflix for a few months at that point. Yeah. And it wasn't that there was gradually more and more disquiet about it. It was that suddenly clip got shared, suddenly that clip went viral, and then it became kind of a scandal overnight.
So looping it back, I guess, I think my key takeaway here, which is, unless you've got, you're number one in your category, or you're a global brand, with the availability or the brand recognition of a Coca-Cola or a Microsoft, understanding the kind of the peer groups or the social networks where you have traction is actually a big advantage. If you want to get as big as a Coca-Cola or a Microsoft, you've kind of got to start by understanding these smaller social networks now, and eventually they will spread and connect, and one day if it aligns, then you'll be that big. But actually just leaving it to random chance and spreading your message everywhere puts you at a disadvantage if you're really trying to be a kind of super large successful company.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. I think that what people can sort of take away and think about are those sort of 2 methods by which this competitive advantage comes about. So that's availability, looking at, do people see your product around? And that comes from being kind of accessible in the first place. And then on top of that, the attractiveness and that idea of how, surveying their friends to see how popular it is. If you can align those 2 things, then you can give your product the best chance. And then finally, the other thing is you talked about, leaving it up to random chance. If you want to roll a 6 if you think of it as rolling a 6 on a dice, the more times you roll the dice, the better chance you have of getting a 6. At the same time, don't read too much from the success of a campaign or of a sales tactic or of, whatever you do. You can get lucky as well as getting unlucky.
I think that's a really interesting point to kind of leave it on. We, as humans, we seek patterns, but yeah, actually it could just be random. Don't look for that pattern where there's not always one.
You could get led in the wrong direction quite quickly, I think.
I think that was fascinating. I hope everyone enjoyed listening. Share it with people, and we can almost conduct a little experiment for ourselves. The more people you share this with, let's test if it grows even quicker for us, because that's really what we're talking about, the availability of our podcast. So yeah, with that, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Say goodbye, Ed.
Goodbye.